All right, now that you have completed your Tints and Shades value worksheet, practicing blending, a gradual transition of light to dark, blending those tints and shades together, now we are ready to move on to your actual painting project. So again, in this project, we are focusing on the pop art movement. You are going to want to select an object that is an everyday object, but the object that you select needs to have a very distinct shape. So examples would be, and I posted some in the Google slide if you need some inspiration, would be a stapler. Obviously I did my example with scissors. You could do a push pen. Okay, if you have smaller items like this as your inspiration, you're gonna be drawing it extra large. So this would be drawn really large to fit the space of your paper. You could do a paper clip, either this type or maybe one like this. Hand sanitizer, although remember, we're not gonna actually see all the details of the interior of the object. That's why it needs to be a distinct shape, but this still is a relatively distinct shape. A clothespin, maybe glasses is a distinct shape. So something that wouldn't work, for example, would be like an eraser. It just kind of looks like a rectangle, and so once you draw this, it's not, and you're gonna fill it with value, you're not gonna know what it is. This is more obvious when it's actually painted pink, for example. Tools are a great option. You could do like a screwdriver, a hammer. I've had students do keys, an iron, okay, a very distinct shape. A large paintbrush. A pencil is obviously really thin. I would recommend trying to come up with something that's gonna fill the space of your paper. Okay, so you're gonna pick your object. For this example, I think I am gonna do the stapler. So you're gonna need to decide which way your object is gonna fit and fill the space of your paper best. In my first example that I did, I chose scissors, which worked more vertical, filling the space. This time, the stapler is more horizontal, so I'm gonna draw it horizontally. Again, I'm gonna enlarge it. I'm gonna sketch it larger than what it is in actual life size, because I wanna fill the space of my paper. You are working with an 8.5 by 11 or 8 by 10 piece of drawing sketch paper. The thicker the paper, the better. If you have cardstock, that's great. So you're gonna need your paper. You're going to need your object that you selected, pencil and eraser, because we're going to draw it first. And then after we draw it, then we'll be ready for paint. And again, you're gonna need black and white. Your one color does not have to be the same color you used in your worksheet. If you wanna try a different color, paper plate, water bin, paintbrush, paper towel. And then lastly, we'll be doing some touch up, and you can choose if you want to use Sharpie marker. We're going to do some accent, either with black paint, or if you have a black Sharpie marker, that would work as well. Okay, so follow along as we create our value object inspired by the pop art movement. So step one is sketching your object lightly, because we don't want to see the pencil lines when we begin painting. So you're sketching super lightly, large. The focal point of this artwork is the object, so we really want to try and fill the space as best as we can. After you have sketched your object large, then we are starting with painting the background first, and you are going to mix your lightest tint, adding a little bit of your color to your white palette. So you're gonna pick which direction you want your brush stroke to go. So you can see that I drew my object a little bit at a diagonal. So I've decided to paint my background at a diagonal, but you could go horizontal with your brush strokes. You could go vertical. It's really your preference, but you need to stick with that same direction. After you've applied your first tint, you're gonna add a little bit more of your color to your white palette. Mix it thoroughly, and you're going to apply your next darkest tint. Notice that I'm continuing with my brush stroke in that same direction, and I am overlapping my second tint with my first tint, because we're practicing blending, so we get that nice gradual transition from light to dark. So you might want to paint a little bit larger section, because you're of each tint and shade, because you're going to overlap just a little bit with the next tint or shade. And again, if you need to dip your paintbrush in a little bit of water just to help blend it more smoothly, that is a great technique to use as well. All right, so now I'm moving on to my third tint. For this project, you need to create 3 tints, one section of your color unmixed, and 2 shades, just like we practiced in the worksheet. And remember, right now we are just painting the background, so you're going to carefully go around the edges of your object. So I'm just carefully outlining and filling in the background, but continuing after I outline, making sure that my brush strokes are still going in that same diagonal direction. After you've completed your third tint, you're washing your brush thoroughly before moving on to your color unmixed. So now I'm painting with my color unmixed. If it helps to turn your paper upside down so you're not resting your hand in wet paint, that's always a good option. Notice that I'm blending my unmixed color into my previous tint, and I'm carefully going around the edges of my object. After I've completed my color unmixed, I'm mixing my first shade. Remember, with shades, we're taking a little bit of the black, mixing it into your color unmixed. I'm filling the whole space of the paper. You should have no white space showing in the background when you are finished. All right, now that we've completed our gradual transition from light to dark in the background, now we are going to do the reverse. We're still working light to dark, but we're putting our lightest tint on the dark side of our background. We don't want to do the same direction, otherwise you'll lose the object in your background. So I'm mixing my lightest tint, but then I'm placing it at the top of my stapler, where my darkest shades are, or it's really my color unmixed, but my dark shades, so that lightest tint really pops against the dark background. And then I'm going to move down. I've turned my paper upside down because it's just easier for me to paint in this direction. So again, feel free to turn your paper whatever makes most sense to you. So now I'm going to fill in the reverse. So I'm continuing to paint light to dark, but I'm moving down my stapler to create a gradual transition of value. So you're just repeating that same process. I had to go switch and get some smaller paintbrushes. So depending on what your object is, I have some smaller sections that I'm really trying to stay within the lines of my object. So make sure you have a variety of sizes of paintbrushes. So I've moved to a thinner paintbrush as I'm trying to stay within the edges of my object. So now I'm moving on to my second tint. Remember, you need 3 tints, 1 area of your color unmixed, and 2 shades, blending those values together. So depending on what your object is, you may want to do some areas that you leave and go back and do in a different, out of order, basically. So you can see it under that lower portion of the stapler. I'm going to go and put a darker shade there, even though I know that's out of order in the gradual transition from light to dark. But whatever makes sense to make your object look realistic or make sense, so you can actually see it. You'll see too that some of those details, I went in and painted a lighter tint just so that you can actually see the details of the stapler and it makes sense. So I do want to see that gradual transition from light to dark, but if there are some areas where it makes sense to do a contrasting color to make it look more realistic, that's up to your discretion, what you think is going to look best. So the last step of this project is then to take either a black Sharpie, or I'm using a really fine small paintbrush, and just outlining, not the whole thing, just accenting some areas around my object and some of the details just to make them pop a little bit more. So again, I'm not looking for a thick outline around the entire object, just in some of the areas to make them pop. And again, those accent details are up to your discretion, whatever you think needs to be outlined in order to make the object look a little bit more realistic. Once you have completed this project, filling in a gradual transition from light to dark in the background and then light to dark in the reverse on your object, leaving no white spaces, and adding accent details with black. Please take an image of your completed project and upload it to Google Classroom to receive a grade.